Today we're going to talk about arousal. Sadly, not the fun kind. We're going to talk about the arousal that's related to training. So what is arousal? Simply, it is the intensity of your motivation. And that's a combination of both physiological and psychological aspects that will influence how motivated or how intense your motivation is during training. And there exists a conceptual sweet spot for every person. A certain amount of arousal or intensity of that motivation is going to lead to better performances either in training or in competition. The problem we have though is you can become overstimulated and suffer from having too much arousal, and that can have negative consequences on your performance in training and in competition. The idea is to find the right amount of arousal that works for you. And people are really going to be individual in this circumstance. Some people will work better and perform better when things are really quiet and calm and they can concentrate. Other people will be quite the opposite, at the other end of the spectrum, where they need a large amount of sort of extrinsic or outside influence and support to lead to better performances. The most common model to explain arousal, and that is, getting the right zone, getting psyched up, being in the zone mentally, is the inverted U model. Now this model suggests that if arousal is too low, performance will also be low. We move up to a sort of midpoint where we, just like an inverted U, the top of the curve, you'll have a higher level of performance sort of at that top point. However, if you go past that point and continue on with even higher levels of arousal, being psyched up, your performance will actually start to decrease. Now this is a really good model to explain arousal in a sort of simple sense. Too little leads to a low performance, too high leads to a low performance, but somewhere in the middle is that perfect or sweet spot which leads to that higher level of performance. Some people will respond differently to a different level of arousal. They might start off with low arousal, with low performance, sort of in the middle, the sweet spot, having a high performance, and just past that point, it all goes to absolute shit and they might choke. We call this the catastrophe model. The idea is it sort of follows an inverted U to a point, but sort of past the ideal amount of arousal, it comes down sharply. Another model I sort of alluded to earlier was the individual zone model. And this suggests that not everyone has the same arousal curve as anyone else. And you might actually respond really well to low amounts of arousal. You might respond to sort of medium amounts of arousal, or you might respond really well to high amounts of arousal. So your own inverted U, your own curve for that ideal sweet spot differs, and everyone's going to be different and unique. So what do you need to do then with arousal? Well, you have to find what works for you. You see some classic high level athletes in sports like golf, and they'll typically, on really important shots, try and get the crowd to be really quiet. And that allows the actual golfer to focus and concentrate on what they're doing. Some external or loud noises or distraction might lead to them choking, like I've talked about with the catastrophe theory. Other sports, like powerlifting, you'll see it's very different. And in powerlifting, a crowd will typically be really loud and noisy and supportive during a competition, whether you're squatting, benching or deadlifting, trying to give you and assist you with your motivation. So what do you have to do? Well, you need to work out what works for you, regardless of what sport you're doing. Try and work out the right amount of arousal that leads to better performances. Some things we can do is just keep a diary and start looking at the emotional and psychological aspects of your training. Not just tracking what your reps and sets are, or your distances and your times. Start looking and trying to narrow down what your actual motivation and arousal is like during the session. If you respond better to lower amounts of arousal, but compete in powerlifting or another sport where there's a really noisy crowd, you might have to work on some psychological, some mental practice to allow you to effectively separate and isolate yourself from all those external influences. So at the end of the day, arousal, it's really important. What is it? It's simply the intensity of your motivation towards training, or the intensity of your motivation towards your competition. You need to find what works for you. Not everyone's going to follow the same inverted U sort of arousal model or arousal pattern. So you have to work out whether you respond better to low, medium or high, and also look at what other conditions and factors might contribute to you having a better performance or a better training session.